Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Tonight's topic is Blinded by Stupidity, how Edward Said's Orientalism made it impossible for the West to even identify its deadliest enemies. And tonight's speaker is Richard Landis. Before we proceed, I would just like to say in today's litigious domain, I would like to just say that all the opinions expressed here are not necessarily reflective of the organizers or Campaign for Truth. So welcome to Campaign for Truth's event. Campaign for Truth arose around about 2007 at the very beginning of the BDS movement, when a few guys organized protests on streets in London from their computer. And those few guys on a computer have now developed into a ubiquitous worldwide brand called the BDS. Campaign for Truth can be defined by two hashtags. The one is Truth Matters, and the other one is Join Up the Dots. Until 2015, Richard Landis was Professor of History at Boston University, and he's currently Senior Fellow at the Center for International Communication at Bar-Ilan University. If you want to know more about Richard, please Google him. You'll find that there are something like 15 pages to scroll through, so we don't have time tonight to go through that. So after this event, you can access his website, the Aegean Stables, take a drink, put your feet up, and have a good read. Richard's last two talks for Campaign for Truth were in 2019 and before the pandemic in 2020, when we covered the Cog War in education and the Cog War and Palestinian Cog War. The Cog War being that means by which to convince your more stronger enemy not to use its superior power. And that really lends to tonight's topic. So I won't carry on much more with that. I'll just say, Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. So I'd like to start with a quick look at two terms that I'll use. One is cognitive war, and cognitive war is defined as what the weaker side in an asymmetric conflict does in order to better position itself. It can't win on the battlefield. So first, as Sharon said, it has to convince the stronger enemy not to use its superior strength. As one of my colleagues here put it, it's to make patriots of your own side and pacifists of the other side. And in the case that we're studying, which is Islam, triumphalist Islam or Islamist, or I call them caliphate or invasion of the West, defined by Sheikh Qaradawi of Hamas, or of the Muslim Brotherhood. He said the West will be conquered by dawah, dawah being preaching or summons to the faith. In other words, not by war, but by calling people to convert to Islam or submit to Islam. With an invasive cog war, you not only have to convince your stronger enemy to leave, as in the case of, say, the Maccabees or the Vietnamese, you have to convince them not, basically you have to convince them to stand down while you invade them. And that is a particularly difficult task. In a sense, it's to induce a kind of cultural autoimmune deficiency syndrome in which the invaded, the targeted country or civilization welcomes its invaders and attacks those within its ranks who defend against the invasion or warn against the invasion. The second term that I'll use is Islamophobia. And in the context of cognitive war, Islamophobia represents one of the great victories of the caliphate or invaders, which is to say that it's defined as, and here I quote a British organization, the Runnymede Trust, the fear of, hatred of, or prejudice against the religion of Islam or Muslims in general, especially when seen as a geopolitical force or a source of terrorism. In other words, it's defined in a very broad way as any kind of negative attitude towards Islam. From a Western point of view, Islamophobia is a kind of reprehensible prejudice. It's racism against Muslims, and it's to be avoided at all costs in order to live up to our anti-racist principles. I just lost my text. Hold on. Come back, please. We can cut this part. Can we cut this one? All right, here we are. Okay. From a Muslim point of view, it's a label of opprobrium to attach to anyone who criticizes Islam, who publishes material that would lead people to dislike Islam or to dislike Muslims, and anyone who associates jihadi terror with Islam. And as such, it's a key weapon in the Caliphate or Cog War arsenal with an astonishing ability to paralyze the West's defenses. It's a, if you will, a cultural immunodeficiency virus. In my book, soon to appear with Academic Studies Press, which at least at the moment is entitled All's Unquiet on the Western Front, Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and the Global Caliphate in the 21st Century, I focus on the first years of the new century, 2000 to 2006, when two terrible developments occurred. On the one hand, global jihad began its direct attack on Western democracies, starting in 2000 with the so-called Al-Aqsa Intifada against Israel, and in 2001 with the 9/11 attack on the United States. And on the other hand, the other terrible development that occurred was that the revolutionary left in the West joined with the jihadis in attacking their joint apocalyptic enemies, the two Satans, Israel and the United States. This marriage of pre-modern sadism, the West is evil and must be destroyed, and postmodern masochism, you're right, we deserve whatever you do to us, was consecrated at Durban in 2001. Less than a week after the close of that conference, where posters of Arafat and bin Laden adorned angry demonstrations, 9/11 happened. And the result was the birth of what I call Y2K mind, a mindset that says when jihadis attack a democracy, blame the democracy. Now, in some senses, jihadi warriors could ask for nothing better. It was a total victory in their insane effort to submit the whole world to Islam. The real question is, how could this happen? How could it be that even more powerfully ingrained How could it be that even more powerfully ingrained in Western culture 20 years later, no. Can we cut some of this?
Yes, yes.
Good,
Can you edit it, Dave?
Yes, yes, yes.
All right.
Okay.
The real question is, how could this happen? How could you get this alliance of Western allegedly progressive forces with the jihadis? And how could it even be more powerfully ingrained in Western culture now 20 years later, despite how self-destructive this attitude, this Y2K mind is? And in trying to understand that, I think one of the most important things to look at is the legacy of Edward Said and his famous book, Orientalism. Orientalism came out in 1978. Came out in 1978, and in it is possibly, it's a book that combines two extraordinary qualities. One, it's one of the most powerful books in terms of its effect on Western culture, and two, it's as bad as it's powerful. In other words, the arguments that it makes are incredibly poorly thought out and yet somehow it just seized the imagination of Westerners, and I'll try and go into some of that. In some senses, Said's Orientalism is the first successful accusation of what now is widespread in the United States, a claim of systemic racism. As he wrote, every European, and what he means by that is also every American, every Westerner, in what he could say about the Orient was a racist, an imperialist, and almost totally ethnocentric. Now, in that sense, what we really had with this was not so much a critique of a serious critique of the way in which Western scholars interpreted the Middle East. It was really, in some senses, an Orientalist. He was behaving like he said the Westerners described Orientalism. He was absorbed with questions of honor and shame, and he was belligerent about the negative view that people had, that scholars had, of the Arab world. And in a sense, what he did was to say, by using this term Orientalism as an accusation, and in some senses it's a placeholder for what will later be Islamophobia, is to say anything that you say that's negative about the Arab world, about the Muslim world, is itself a form of racism and a form of ethnocentrism, Orientalism. So any critique of the embedded nature of despotic rule in the Arab world is considered Orientalist. Any complaint about triumphalist jihad that wants to dominate others is Orientalist. And as a result, he literally insisted that we blind ourselves to the very radical, to the very negative aspects that played so important a role in the following generation. So as a result, you get this picture, and this is a description by Martin Kramer in a book that I recommend everybody should read and reread, and is available for free on the internet, called Ivory Towers in Sand, Ivory Towers on Sand. What we get as a result of the accepting the revolution in Middle Eastern studies that came as a result of people buying into Orientalism was a picture of a Middle East, quote, full of benign and nonviolent Muslim movements, i.e. the proper take on what Islamism was, and the end result of an Islamic Reformation, sort of like the Protestant Reformation, which he seems to forget led to hundreds of years of religious war, all promoting political pluralism in their respective polities, and second, a flourishing of civil society and a withering away of the authoritarian state. In 1982, in other words, 2 years after Khomeini took over Iran, he wrote a book which was a follow-up called Covering Islam, in which he included even the most belligerent and imperialistic expressions of Islam in the umbrella of his post-colonial attack on Western racist ways of knowing about the Arab world, referring with full Saidian scorn to an article in the Chicago Tribune. He noted that a reporter named Mosley's attack on Iran was supported by a truly cosmic editorial in his paper, the Chicago Tribune, the same day, accusing Khomeini of nothing less than holy war on the world. The jihad motif has become the single most important motif in Western media representations of Islam. And according to him, this was pure Orientalism. It was unacceptable. It showed ridiculous prejudice on the part of Westerners. The fact that Mosley and the Chicago Tribune were exactly right about what Khomeini's plans were and what his desires were had nothing to do with it. We were not permitted to refer to Muslims and to jihad and to the Quran and to the ideology and the Sunnah of the Arabs in negative terms. So any attention to jihad, which clearly made Muslims look bad, add to their infidel targets was nothing more than, quote, an ideological portrait of Islam and the Arabs that suited dominant pro-imperial and pro-Zionist trends in US foreign policy, unquote. Or, as Pakistani economist at Northeastern University, Shahid Alam put it in 2002, quote, the false notions we need to give up are the Orientalist narratives of an Islam that has been misrepresented as irrational, misogynist, fatalist, and fanatical. So you get a sense here of the way in which anybody who reacting to 9/11 might consider the problem to be a problem that derives from an Islamic ideology, not necessarily all of Islam, but certainly within Islam, is immediately dismissed as a Zionist, racist, and in today's language, white supremacist. Now, this attitude, which had been developed, as I said, since at least 1982, 1978 by Said and his followers, had already led Said just before 9/11, literally weeks before 9/11, to say in a classic anti-Orientalist sneer, speculations about the latest conspiracy to blow up buildings, sabotage commercial airliners, and poison water supplies were highly exaggerated stereotyping. So in other words, just before 9/11, he dismissed the plans, the people who were warning that this was about to happen. And I just read recently that there was a warning actually from the Taliban that 9/11 was going to happen, dismissed it as just a bunch of highly exaggerated stereotyping. In doing so, Said illustrated nicely the claim made years before Khomeini's takeover by his most hated Orientalist colleague, Bernard Lewis, that, quote, the present inability of political, journalistic, and scholarly alike, the present inability, political, journalistic, and scholarly alike, to recognize the importance of the factor of religion in the current affairs of the Muslim world was one of the major problems facing the field. And on the other hand, in his demented refusal to understand that the people he was protecting were actually against not only Western civilization, but against the very world that he so much enjoyed at Columbia, he was protecting by throwing a veil of ignorance over their intended victims, namely we Westerners. He was protecting the very enemies of the world that he enjoyed. This veil of ignorance promoted by Said and his followers, rather than bursting with the twin outbreaks of global jihad at the beginning of the new century, the Al-Aqsa Intifada and the Oslo and the 9/11, grew even more rigid and impermeable in response to these attacks on democracies. University of Columbia Middle East professor and Said colleague, Richard Bulliett, wondered, does this mean I'm throwing out my copy of Orientalism out the window? Does 9/11 mean? Maybe it does. Well, maybe it should have, but no. On the contrary, 9/11 prompted Said to heap scorn for the just spectacularly proven clash of civilizations thesis. And not only did the rest of the field follow his lead, including Bulliett, but so did many journalists, human rights activists, and public intellectuals. When, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, a graduate student in Middle Eastern studies at Princeton University, William McCants, wanted to change his thesis topic from Rumi, a Muslim mystic, to jihad in order to help understand his society's enemies, his thesis advisor told him that if he did, he'd have to leave academia because the only jobs he would find as a jihad specialist were in think tanks, but there would be no place for him in a department of Middle Eastern studies. And the professor was right. His entire career has been subsequently only in think tanks. in academia after 2000, the flip that had been developing over the course of the last 20 years was swift. The very prejudice against Palestinians that Said had complained so bitterly about in his book, The Question of Palestine, which came just between Orientalism and covering Islam, was now turned back on the supporters of Israel, and no appeal to liberal values about expressing unpopular ideals to which Said had so effectively appealed to his colleagues 20 years earlier could stop the onslaught. Shahid Alam, a prime example of the new Red-Green Alliance, who compared the 9/11 attackers to the Minutemen at Lexington, claimed triumphantly in 2003 that what was previously unsayable, that is, Israel is genocidal, Nazi-like, and racist, was now freely proclaimed in academia. Dissenters from this new teaching found themselves increasingly marginalized. I was one of them. The response of the post-colonial academics to the fake news of a Jenin massacre in 2002, which gave birth to the boycott movement that Durbin had called for, despite pushback, became a growing force. And so what you had with the advent of 2000 was that the attitude that Said and his followers had built up, in which everything negative about the West, everything negative about the Arab and the Muslim world was a reflection of Western belligerence and racism, that they would even say such things, and B, whatever negative was there was the fault of the West, the sort of Chomsky thesis that the reason they're dictators in the Arab world is not because there's nobody else that America can deal with, but that America's support for dictators was the cause of this plague of dictators in the Arab world. All of this preliminary work, all of a sudden, if you will, crystallized as a result of the jihadi attacks in the early 21st century into this Y2K mind. And one of the ways that you can see it is in the success of Islamophobia, which was a term that had been developed in the late 1990s. I think the Runnymede Trust's statement is 1994 or 1996. It was used to some extent, but after 2000, it comes into full use. And it had an astonishing success. And for the British listeners out there, I'm sure you'll be familiar with what happened in Rotherham, in which over a course of 15 years, Muslim Pakistani men systematically raped and turned into sexual slaves British infidel schoolgirls down to the age of 11 and 12. And nobody, not the teachers, not the parents, not the school system, not the principal, not the journalists, not the police, nobody was willing to publicly oppose it because they were afraid of being called Islamophobic. That's an incredibly powerful term. And I think that the impact of Islamophobia was to create, to use another medical analogy, a kind of chronic insensitivity to pain, which is a disease whereby the nerves do not bring signal to the brain that some part of the body is experiencing pain. And somebody with this condition can actually burn their hand, literally burn it off, and not know it because the brain isn't feeling, the brain's been anesthetized. And in this analogy, the journalists who won't tell us what kind of pain we're suffering from aggressive jihadis is literally, they're the nerves, and the brain, the public sphere where we are, is operating in a kind of ignorance. Islamophobia has impact even on intelligence gathering, a kind of willful blindness, which already a book by, forget his name, McCarthy, wrote a book called Willful Blindness about the 1994 attack on the World Trade Center, which, had it been followed up, would have prevented the second one, but wasn't. I believe that a very high up figure in the British police, after 7/7/2005, after the attack on the British transportation system by jihadis, said, there's no connection in my mind between Islam and terrorism. So you have this kind of, again, it's a kind of teaching, it's an orthodoxy, which systematically ignores stuff. And as a result, you get a kind of flourishing of a jihadi ideology right under Western noses. And probably the most significant dimension of this is the hostility to Jews. Attacks on Jews start literally the day after the footage of Muhammad Abdullah's alleged cold-blooded murder in his father's arms by the IDF was published first by France 2 on September 30th, 2000, and continued and has continued and is going on today, as we can see with, for instance, what just happened with the verbal assault on the Jewish kids who were in a bus going to a Hanukkah celebration this year. Lee Rigby, who was publicly beheaded by a jihadi. A week after that event, the Oxford Union debate raised the question, is Islam a religion of peace? And that proposition won by a vote of 286 to 168. So we're talking about allegedly some of the most intelligent people in world society, not just British society, and that's the way they think. Recently, the Deutsche Welle, which is a major British broadcasting organization, the British equivalent of the BBC, all of a sudden discovered that the people who are working in their Arab service have been posting virulently anti-Semitic stuff for an extended period of time. And they had no idea, and they had no idea that the news that they were allegedly publishing was, in fact, anti-Zionist propaganda. So Islamophobia, within years, dominant trope. And that trope insisted, and this for me was mind-blowing when I first heard it, and I heard it from a friend, a colleague, who herself was Jewish, in which she said that the 21st century of Nazi anti-Semitism is Islamophobia. Now, what she's basically saying is that the danger that the West is going to engage in a Nazi racist genocidal rage and start slaughtering Muslims is as great a threat today as the anti-Semitic strains that were afoot in Europe in the early 20th century. And of course, the bitter irony of this is that the greatest carriers of Nazi genocidal anti-Semitism today are precisely the Muslims who believe in global jihad, whether it's Hamas or Al-Qaeda. Now, what I'd like to do in reflecting on how this could have happened, how in 2000, all of a sudden, this rather insane notion of Y2K mind, that if jihadis attack a democracy, it's the fault of the democracies, could happen. And one of the things that clued me into it was a comment in one of the chapters in my book is about the Danish cartoon scandal. And there's a book on it by Jette Clausen, who's a Danish woman, a professor at Brandeis of sociology. And in it, she refers at a number of points to what she calls a moral panic. And in her language, the moral panic is the people who are all of a sudden alarmed about Islam, and who are highly critical of Islam. And she feels that that kind of negative attitude, which Said would readily call Orientalism, represented a kind of moral panic. Now, being one of the people who believes that fear of Islam is not a phobia, in other words, it's not irrational, there are definitely things to fear, just like there are things to fear in any number of religions. But at the moment, Islam represents the most to be feared source of these ideas, or what Bill Maher called the mother lode of bad ideas. Um, this struck me as a strange use of the term moral panic. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was something of a projection involved here. In fact, if there was a moral panic in 2000 and 2001, it was the moral panic of people like her, of good, liberal, progressive, well-meaning people, when faced with an enemy whom they literally could not digest. The moral panic of 2000 was the question: how do well-meaning, earnest, peace-loving, post-testosteronic, vulnerable, open, highly self-aware and self-critical, cosmopolitan, inclusive, open, egalitarian, justice-pursuing, lovers of the other, in all the hybridic diversity that love brings, who believe that war is not the answer, that violence never solved anything, that humans are naturally peaceful, that prejudice and racism are terrible, and that if we're only kind and understanding to those hostile to us, we can win them over to voluntary, non-coercive, positive-sum relations in which everyone wins. How can people like this respond to the declaration of a war on them by a self-declared enemy who shares none of these values, indeed embodies everything progressives oppose: misogyny, hatred of the other, slaveholding, aspirations to genocide and world dominion? And I think what happens is a moral panic. In other words, if we oppose these people, we fight them, we take them at their word, then we begin to resemble the very things we hate in the enemy. So instead, they prefer denial, even acceptance of their enemy's terms. In 2006, after a massive wave of lethal journalism in which Hezbollah propaganda was passed on by Western media as news, Judith Butler welcomed Hamas and Hezbollah into the global progressive left because, she explained, they were anti-imperialist. Now, that takes a special kind of, to be honest, stupidity. Hezbollah and Hamas are part of a global jihad that is the most primitive, imperialist, world-conquering movement one can imagine. And because they're anti-American imperialist, and they're anti-American imperialist because that's their rival in imperialism, but for Judith Butler, their anti-Americanism trumped everything else, and she welcomed this imperialist movement as an anti-imperialist movement into the global progressive left, or as Michael Totten and others referred to it, the anti-imperialism of fools. So what 2000 taught me was the power of envy in the world. Here were Europeans preening in their moral superiority, berating Israel and the United States, empowering their enemies just so they could pose as morally superior. And apparently nothing, not even self-preservation, could be worth the loss of posturing as good people. Their moral panic arose from their inability to allow themselves the stain of defending themselves. They had to stay pure in order to turn Israel into a pariah, and that was worth the suicidal embrace of a mortal enemy. In April 2002, I've already referred to this, when the first democracy to resist jihadi suicide terrorists attacked their headquarters established in territory that country had ceded in pursuit of peace, namely Jenin and the West Bank, progressive infidels, disinformed by their lethal journalist media about Israelis massacring Palestinians like Nazis, demonstrated in large angry crowds around the world, calling the armies resisting suicide terror Nazis and wearing mock suicide vests to show their solidarity with their own enemies. Any of you who have seen the movie Independence Day will remember the scene where, the flying saucers have stopped over all the major cities in the world. And in this particular city, the hippies have climbed to the roof of a skyscraper and they're welcoming them and dancing and saying, "Welcome to our planet." And the bottom of the ship opens up and zaps them into oblivion. Well, at least those people didn't know what the extraterrestrials were thinking, but anybody could know what the suicide bombers were thinking, and any sane European would have known, any sane European infidel would have known that they were the targets as well, as they would soon be. For me, that 2002 demonstrations against Israel were the climax of the moral idiocy of global progressives in the early century, an idiocy they faithfully adhere to this day, now weaponized by social media shaming mobs, which I call Y2K mind, and to which I think Edward Said played an absolutely central role in, if you will, grooming us to our own defeat. It consecrated a noxious marriage between a sadistic pre-modern apocalyptic movement, the global caliphate, and a masochistic postmodern apocalyptic movement, most recently called woke, which came together around a shared antichrist, the two Satans, US and Israel. And that noxious marriage comes as a result, I submit, of a supersessionist moral panic, a desperate need to think of oneself as supremely moral, so much so that the loss of the moral high ground, even momentarily, would be an unbearable blow to the narcissistic ego. And Israel is only the first sacrificial victim of that grotesque narcissism. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much for, just let me fix this viewing. Yeah. Thank you so much for that incredibly interesting overview of the effects of Edward Said's Orientalism on our world today. I think when I first heard you speak in 2015 at our BBC event in London, you may remember when when you were famously barred from entering the House of Commons to give your talk, and you had to speak locally for us at a community event of 600. I don't think I'd yet joined up those dots, even though in the subsequent years we were looking at infiltration into universities, infiltrations into schools, following all the protests on street, the Mavi Marmara, all the attacks on Israel and so on. And I think only when I read that chapter 3 of your book that you sent me a little while ago, did the penny drop of that link between Edward Said and his post-colonial theory and what is going on today with the BBC that we saw with the Chabad kids, where the BBC is in fact reporting that they were allegedly attacked, but that was because after the attack, they ostensibly heard some slurs against Muslims from the bus, which only the BBC can hear. So we see that kind of inversion of reporting, that the victim becomes responsible for their attacks on them.
Blame the democracy.
Yeah. So it's our fault that we get attacked by the enemy. So for that, you've joined up those dots for me. I also realize now in retrospect that Edward Said was a bit of a rock star to his followers in the day. I recently re-listened to a talk that he gave at Berkeley University, where tickets were almost on sale at eBay prices,
Right.
with thousands of these students being indoctrinated by this man. So I thank you for that. And I think that David's got some questions that he's put together from other viewers that I think I'll hand over to him to pose to you.
All
Thank you,
right.
Richard.
You're welcome. Thank you. Oh, by the way, that chapter I sent you was actually chapter 3 of a collection of essays edited by a Turkish scholar on Edward Said, and he solicited it because he wanted something critical. Most of the other essays in that book are highly, almost worshipful of Said. So, I mean, the fact that it was published at all is certainly in that volume is interesting, but it's not part of my book.
Well, I think you've done a great job in that essay. I mean, you've really encapsulated everything that's happened since since the 1970s, in fact. So,
all right.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Edward, Edward, Richard, confusing the two. I've taken a lot of the questions and tried to group them into specific categories.
All right.
And the first one, as moderator, is my own question. There's no doubt in my mind about the ambiguity of Orientalism as a work of art. It has a great deal to offer, and there's a great deal, as you said, to criticize. There's a great deal of good and there's a great deal of bad. Having only read it lately and not realizing at the time that he wrote a second book on Palestine and the Palestinian cause, my feeling from Orientalism is, yes, he's raising a great argument, he's putting many views forward, but he is at heart laying the foundation for a Palestinian cause. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think he was well aware of it. I mean, first of all, for up until 67, Said was something of a, we talk about invisible Jews. He was something of an invisible Palestinian, if you will. I mean, he was raised in Egypt. He went to private school. Arabic is not his mother tongue, and he more or less lost it. He was a professor of English literature, and a really good one at that, up until 67. And then in 67, the dramatic defeat of the Arab world by the Israelis was a huge blow to him. And it was what, in a sense, awakened his defense of the cause. In honor shame terms, he was utterly humiliated by the 67 war. And so, the sort of build up to Orientalism can already be seen in essays that he wrote in 1976 in response to the UN resolution on Zionism as racism. So that's all part, it was all part of an effort to reinterpret the world, which he was astonishingly successful in doing. And so the real trilogy is Orientalism 78, The Question of Palestine 80, and Covering Islam 82. And in those three books, he really nailed down this incredibly damaging attitude, which was so perfect for the conduct of jihadi Cog War in the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. The second question comes, and I've once again embroidered the question. The basic question is, why does he not talk about religion? And I've changed that to say, why do you think that a notable absence in his discourse is the subject of the Holy Land, which arguably is the most shared and accepted view of the region, and certainly did not rise out of Western imagination, as he claims.
Right. Well, I think he ignores religion, first of all, because in terms of religion, the world that he's trying to protect from criticism is far behind the modern West in terms of an attitude which he himself accepted and adopted. I mean, he wasn't, first of all, he's Christian, he's not Muslim, and he's not an observant one in any case. In fact, most of his work, even his later work, is dedicated to proclaiming himself a sort of secular cosmopolitan member who has gone beyond any kind of tribal identification. And that's how he presented himself to the West. So on the one hand, he wanted to protect the Muslim world. If we paid attention to the role of religion in the Middle East, it would make the Middle East look pretty bad, particularly in comparison with the secular approach of the modern West. So on the one hand, he didn't want to look at it. On the other hand, what he wanted to do was to insist that the way the Middle East should be understood is to understand it in Western terms. In other words, in terms of economic relations, in terms of political relations, in terms of various kinds of Western categories, nationalism and so on, which in fact had much less traction in the Middle East than more, shall we say, atavistic or from Said's point of view, primitive attitudes. And so as a result, you end up with these people who insist on projecting onto Islamists a kind of, this is one of the dangers of Western cognitive egocentrism, is that, people say, oh, well, what we're going through now is a Muslim Reformation like the Protestant Reformation, or what the Muslims need is a Reformation like the Protestant Reformation. The only problem is the Protestant Reformation was based on back to the sources. When Christians go back to their sources, unless it's the book of Revelation, they're going back to sources that are profoundly pacifist. Turn the other cheek, love your neighbor, love your enemy as yourself, and so on. If you go back to the Quran, particularly the sort of latter parts of the Quran, Muhammad, when the Salafi say we want to be the companions of the Prophet, they mean we want to go on jihad. They don't mean we want to sit around being good citizens. So I think that across the boards, religion was something that either couldn't be discussed or had to be discussed in the language and projecting the attitudes of Westerners onto religion in that area of the world, rather than looking, and that's what Bernard Lewis had said, the roots of Muslim rage were in the sense that Muslims had that in the modern world, and particularly with the success of the modern Zionists, Islam had been utterly humiliated, and that was an unbearable condition, particularly for triumphalists who historically, throughout the history of Islam, from the first conquests to at least to Napoleon, had been a dominant religion, had been visibly dominant. So so religion is really something he couldn't tolerate. Instead, he said, you got to see it in terms of economic relations and stuff. Well, people who have studied something like the trade union movement in the unions in the Muslim world find that they're not successful at all, because clan associations are much stronger than class associations or solidarity across groups because they have the same occupation. But again, that would be Orientalism to say that, tribal culture trumps something like unionism.
So would you then say that even though the concept of the Holy Land is accepted on a global basis by most societies, whether some regard it as hocus pocus or some regard it as absolute truth, was disingenuous and duplicitous of him to cast aside? that he knew what he
Well,
was
look,
doing.
yeah, I mean, he wasn't alone. To this day, like when Benny Morris was actually um, given, he was asked to write a book about 1948 by a publishing house that paid him a substantial advance. And when he came out with the book, in his work, he realized that the war in 1948 was it was a jihad, it was a religious war. And in fact, for those who don't know it, the Muslim Brotherhood really hits its stride as a result of recruiting people to go to war against the nascent Jewish state. When he submitted it to the publishers, they refused it. They forewent. They gave up on their advance, but they refused to publish it because they considered it Islamophobic. And so, by and large, to this day, most people in the enlightened West think that this is not a religious war. This is a national uprising. And in fact, that national uprising attitude gives us some really foolish stuff like one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. You literally misread what happened with the Intifada of 2000, what I call the Oslo Jihad. You literally misread it as a freedom fighting uprising against imperialist Israelis. And that's literally the formula that gives you Y2K mind. When the jihadis attacked the first democracy, they were seen as the freedom fighters, and the democracy was seen as the imperialist colonizers. So I think that in taking that attitude, he shared it with a whole wide range of sort of progressive, agnostic or atheist thinkers who didn't want to view this conflict as a religious one. So right now, the term that's somewhat widely used by journalists, and for me is a tell of how little they understand about the region, is that it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is very good for the Israelis as the Goliath and the Palestinians as the Palestinians as the David. But in fact, the term intifada means the shrugging that a great beast like a camel or a cow does when he shrugs his hide to chase a fly, which tells you what they think of the Jews in that area. They're a pesky fly that they should be able to just shrug off. And so for me, it's not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not even the Israeli-Arab conflict, which is more accurate. It's the Israeli, open paren, sovereign Jews, close paren, versus the triumphalist Muslims, for whom an independent state of infidels in Dar al-Islam is a blasphemy.
Okay, well, time limits us, so I'm going to end on a lighter note and pin you to the spot. Okay. Who, in your opinion, won the war between Edward Said and Bernard Lewis?
Oh, look, I mean, there's a great quote from Maimonides. I just read a book that starts with that quote, which is, the truth isn't changed by whether everybody thinks it's true or everybody thinks it's not true. Bernard Lewis was right about what was going on in the Middle East. Edward Said couldn't have been more wrong, both about Western scholarship and what's going on in the Middle East. And yet, at least so far, he's won. I mean, you just saw it in May. The last exchange riots in Israel and Gaza occurred, you literally had entire departments, including Jewish studies departments, signing collective statements that were intellectually absurd, empirically misinformed, against Israel, supporting the Palestinians, and not mentioning Hamas. So, and now you've got Middle Eastern Studies Association, which Said took over, coming out with a statement in support of BDS. So there's no question that Said won in the academy, and the consequences have been disastrous, both for the academy and for Western foreign policy. Will he win in the longer run? I hope not.
Okay, so I might have some good news for you, Richard, on that point.
What's that?
I just read today that Robert Jenrick, the ex-community secretary in the British Parliament, in the government here, seemingly announced a couple of days ago that BDS is about to be banned by the British government. Now, that is a huge coup for sanity, because if you Google BDS,
Right.
you will come across not BDS, but Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Now, you know what the Palestine Solidarity Campaign is.
It's from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, as if Palestinian leadership ruling over that area, anybody would be free, including the Palestinians, who now in the latest poll, 93% of the Arabs in East Jerusalem prefer to be under Israeli rule than under Palestinian rule. I mean, it's literally, it's an anti-intellectual movement.
Absolutely. So if my question is, and I'm certainly going to be writing to Jenrick about that if they ban the BDS, considering that they're so googly mixed together, surely they have to ban the PSC. And I have to say, about in 4 years ago, 3 years ago, we wrote a big report to the government about the PSC on why they should be banned. And so hopefully we're edging our way towards that. And maybe the prediction that Said might have won that debate will prove incorrect.
Well, I'm not sure what the ban is, whether the ban is on academic institutions adopting BDS, which strikes me as a reasonably sane attitude, or that BDS doesn't have the right to espouse its beliefs, which I don't think is a good idea. I mean, being an American, I believe, or at least grown up in America, I believe that, you know, the answer to the abuse of free speech is to argue against it. What's so bad today is that cancel culture has made it impossible for people to speak out against this stuff. The last thing I want is for the BDSers and the people who run a Palestinian, Israeli apartheid week to claim that their free speech is being infringed on. I think it's important that people understand that they're the ones who won't let people contradict them, and they're the ones against free speech. So for instance, we just had, I forget who it was, but this woman from CARE made a speech where she said some really nasty things about Jews as the enemy, and she got attacked and she said, "I feel unsafe." You should feel unsafe, not unsafe for your life, but unsafe for your reputation.
I totally agree with you. I'm not a person who believes in shutting people up. I think everybody should have the right to speak, unless they're going to abuse that right and cause people to be harmed. But I believe everybody should have a right to speak. And I'm hoping the government is not going to ban people talking about problems they might have with Jews or Israel. That's their right. But I'm hoping that they're going to ban this whole idea of boycotting an ally of this country,
formally,
which I think is wrong. We need to support our allies. And if we don't like the government's allies, we need to vote our government out and change our government. But at the moment, Israel is a very staunch ally of this government, and boycott,
and not just of the government, of the country,
yeah.
There's no better illustration of what I call this cultural AIDS problem than the fact that Western intellectuals attack Israel and side with the jihadis. I mean, how self-destructive can you get?
So one of the issues that somebody posed to me at the start of this talk, and we discussed it before, is how did Edward Said manage to blind the West when intelligence agencies of the West knew that the PLO had been the brainchild of the KGB, and this was all happening in the middle of the Cold War? And I think you've answered that question very succinctly in your talk tonight. And so I really want to thank you, Richard. And as always, we'll welcome you back for more talks. So thank you very much.
Pleasure to give talks with you.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.